We have a fantastic panel here, and I'll give them some brief introductions. On the screen from Belfast, we have Professor Alan Jones. He is a chartered architect, having created award-winning low-energy projects in the luxury of the southeast of England and the low-cost economy of his native Northern Ireland. He is a professor of architecture at the School of Natural and Built Environment within Queen's University, Belfast, and for the last 2 years, Alan has been president of the Global Royal Institute of British Architects. He strongly advocates the role of architects to unlock value, realise opportunities, and address the major risks and challenges facing society, government, and business. Next on the panel, we have Lilli Matson, who's the Chief Health, Safety and Environment Officer at Transport for London, TfL. She leads the work to make the capital safe and attractive for all journeys, including delivering the Mayor's transport strategy and the goal of the Vision Zero Action Plan, where no one is injured or killed on the transport network. In her role at TfL, she is working to address the climate crisis and achieve a net zero carbon railway by 2030, ensuring TfL's environmental performance is exemplary. And next, we have Victoria Hills, who is Chief Executive of the Royal Town Planning Institute. With over 22 years' experience in senior roles, she makes the case for resourcing planning and advocating the importance of putting planning at the heart of the government's delivery of the quality places where people want to live. She is driving forward the RTPI's corporate strategy for its 25,000 members, of which I am one, focusing on raising the profile of planning and promoting a diverse and inclusive profession. Victoria is also currently serving as a commissioner on the Essex Climate Action Commission and sits on the advisory group to the government's COVID-19 Recovery Commission. Finally, to my left, we have Simon Hills, who's an urban planner, working at the intersection between design, local economic development and sustainability at Foster & Partners. His focus is on the application of data, technology and design solutions to improve livability and ecology in the urban environment. Simon also represents the needs of young people in the city, holding a steering committee position for the Academy of Urbanism's Young Urbanist Group, and is a tutor and educational partner at Minerva University based in San Francisco. So thank you to our panel. Today we're talking about cities and how they can adapt to climate change. I live in the city of Bristol, where the council was the first in the UK to declare a climate change emergency in 2018. Since then, they have adopted an ambitious climate change plan committing to carbon neutrality by 2030. For me, this demonstrates the key importance of government, whether that be local or national, in driving policies and actions to meet the sustainability agenda. However, fewer than half of European cities have climate adaptation plans in place, and this brings us to our discussion today. How can cities develop through urban planning but remain environmentally aware and active? Is there a better, more sustainable to build cities from the ground up or retrofit? And what is the future? How will climate change in combination with remote working affect how we plan our cities? So, Alan, if I go to you first, what are your thoughts on how we continue to develop our cities? Should we be adapting or retrofitting?
I would argue that it's a combination of both. It's well known that the most sustainable building is one that already exists, but it may well be that its performance isn't as good as it should be. I think we need to fold into this conversation the impact of COVID and looking at how, for example, in central business districts, we're going to have less people working. You know, we're going to have reduced densities, and that creates opportunities. I think we have to decide on what buildings we want to keep and adapt, and then when we have to build new, we then have to be surgical in the precision to decide where the new development is and the maximum amount of benefit that can be brought from that.
I think that probably brings us quite well to Victoria and spatial planning. What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you very much, Lydia. And we're actually up to 26,000 members now. We grew in the pandemic, and that's really a sign of the times that planning, as you said, we're very much focused on ensuring it is part of the green recovery, but also delivering on a much broader agenda. I should just congratulate the Chamber of Commerce on the title Impact 2021, because it does rather feel that 2021 is the year when there's a critical mass sort of acknowledgement that we are actually now all feeling the impacts of climate change. Many of us may have felt it or been aware of it for years, but in terms of the wider public, I think it's probably this year. The stars are aligning for the UK in terms of COP26 and the world coming here either virtually or in person to discuss these things further. You asked about retrofit and new build. I just want to share a couple of stats, if I may, as to why new build is very relevant. I completely agree with Alan, retrofit. The world's population is significantly still growing and will continue to do so. And just to share a few World Economic Forum stats with you, because I was brushing up on sort of how many people are there actually in the world, and we're up to about 7.88 million currently, on a trajectory for 8.5 billion, billion, by 2030, which is when the UN's Sustainable Development Goals are due to have been met. And currently we've got about 1 in 3 people who live in China or India, and this is obviously set to increase significantly with a focus of mass migration, population growth. Clearly we all need to think about doing things very, very differently if we're going to cope with that level of population growth as a planet, because let's face it, we're all in it together. Things that happen elsewhere will have impacts on us and vice versa. So I do think there is a significant role for leadership within the UK, UK and Ireland to take a real role in demonstrating how we build better, greener, cleaner. Yes, retrofit is significantly important, Alan said that, but just in the UK alone, the government seems to be committed still to at least 300,000 homes a year, every year, and that's just the residential, that's not even the real estate. Clearly, we feel within that you need a strong regulatory framework. The planning system is okay, but clearly the national planning policy statement could be strengthened, and we'll be discussing that with the new Secretary of State, Michael Gove, as we welcome him over the course of the weekend. He's been busy already. He's already renamed his department into, I have to look at this because I've got sort of MHCLG ingrained, but it's now the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, DLUHC. Doesn't roll off the tongue, so I'm calling it Luke. It's the Department for Luke, I can remember that one. But we need stronger policy levers in that spatial system, and we need, why do we need that? To encourage what we're building new to be policy compliant, but go above and beyond on net zero. But also, we really want to get going in terms of attracting green, clean, innovative businesses to the UK. It's great that, for example, a lot of Swedish companies do really great stuff in Sweden and elsewhere, but we want those factories, we want that investment in the UK, so we need a strong planning framework to provide that certainty for that inward investment to come, because I think, as one of the earlier speakers made the point, this isn't just about civic society. Yes, you can have those fiscal and policy levers, but ultimately you need the investment, you need the money to come in those industries to provide that employment that helps to deliver on net zero, whether that's commercial or residential real estate. So probably got a few things to say a bit further on, but I won't monopolise my bit. As you can tell, I'm passionate about this. I could talk all morning, but I'm conscious we've got other speakers.
Thanks, Victoria. Simon, what are your thoughts on this?
Sure, I would just, I'd have to agree with both Victoria and Alan. We do need to build a huge amount of new housing in this country as the population grows and we face migration, but also we shouldn't underestimate the opportunities of retrofit. And as an architecture practice, we're trying to encourage people to think about the way we build or retrofit buildings in a new kind of framework, and that framework is the life cycle carbon assessment. So not just looking at how a building performs and what are the energy costs of the operation, but also the energy costs of the construction and the kind of transport cost of moving the materials to site. So looking at the whole picture, cradle to grave or cradle to cradle, as we hope to recycle materials. And then just using a kind of typical UK office as an example, in the UK, about 2/3 of the embodied carbon, life cycle carbon in an office will be in the construction. And only 1/3 will be in the actual operation, the kind of the M&E services, the heating, etc. So we really can't underestimate the need to refurbish, especially our inner city buildings, and we've estimated that, you know, on average, give or take, we can make around a kind of 40% reduction in carbon just from refurbishment. And then I'd also just add very quickly that on this point, we feel that we always have to exceed the current standards. There's lots of building standards about how they environmentally perform, things like WELL and BREEAM, and these are fantastic things, but none of them in our calculations actually deliver or limit our carbon emissions to a 1.5 degree temperature change according to our Paris Agreement commitments. So we always have to exceed the current policy and the current best practice standards. And that's my.
Thank you very much.
My point.
Lilli, London's obviously got a very established transport infrastructure, and we've seen lots of news stories in the last year of the flooding of cities worldwide, of their undergrounds, and due to climate change. How do you see us sort of adapting to climate change in terms of transport?
Yeah, no, really good question. I mean, just before I come to the adapt bit, I would like to talk about the sort of tackling the mitigate bit first, because it is very relevant to the question you were asking earlier. And I mean, cities are fantastically organic beasts, and London's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, and has the complete capacity to evolve and to be a sustainable city. If you look at what the role of transport is in enabling that, it should just be about making people's lives easier. So very much the strategy in London is about reducing the need to travel. There was a lot of the debate where it got a bit tricky in the early discussion was like, can we actually reduce consumption? Well, with transport, we actively are trying to reduce consumption, and that is how you design cities, is to make places convenient where you can walk and cycle and do as many journeys as you can with no carbon impact at all. And overall, our strategy is to achieve what we call a very large modal share. Modal share is the number of journeys that are taken by a certain mode. So currently in London, around 63% of journeys are made by walking or cycling or public transport, and our goal is that by 2040 that is 80%. We know with our modelling that that will allow us to meet our carbon targets. And we have the target running, as we said, a net zero railway by 2030. But that's all working within existing infrastructure, retrofitting it, and adding new infrastructure. And when you add those new infrastructure, you build it in places where people can make those journeys easily. So they're not even thinking about transport. So the strategy is about enabling the city to grow sustainably by making transport choices the right choices, sustainable choices, the easiest choices. And that requires regulation, retrofitting, new build, the whole thing. The challenge of adapting to a changing climate is absolutely here and now. We've seen the flooding. It is very significant risk, I think, to cities and to London and its infrastructure. Do have plans in place. We know what the flooding risk is. The mayor actually has just launched a report today talking about unmitigated climate impact, leading to the tube potentially being too hot, to be comfortable at various points in summer. And I think many of you would always say, I think we're already there at some points. So there's a lot of forward planning in terms of what we need to do to retrofit or adapt the transport system. But essentially, it has to work within that system of actually ensuring that we're making the right journeys and reducing car use in the city.
Okay, brilliant. So I feel from what you're saying that to achieve these strategies, we need strong policies in place to hold people accountable. and to encourage businesses to adapt. What do you see the roles of the different groups in bringing about these changes in our cities? Is there any specific groups? Victoria, maybe start with you.
If I can start with the land in particular, and I was sort of alluding to having a strong framework, and really, one of the reasons I got into it as a geography graduate was to try and link together land use and transport. And here we are, sort of 25 years on. We've done a brilliant job in London, which is fantastic, and that's because you've got this all-encompassing London plan, which is sort of the umbrella. If you're playing a game of top trumps, that wins, and everything else has to fall into line, and that provides a strategic outlook of where things go, and particularly transport infrastructure, but other infrastructure as well. And so one of the things we're very keen to talk about with the new Secretary of State, Gove, is how we can roll that out across the other cities. Because at the moment, London's the only place in the UK that has spatial development strategy powers. Manchester, having said that, Mayor Burnham has managed to get 9 out of the 10 local authorities to hold hands and produce a spatial plan. Doesn't have the same statutory status as London, but it's a fantastic Herculean effort. If you follow that story, Google Manchester Greenbelt, you'll know what I'm talking about. But that's just 2 cities. Birmingham, which is our second city, isn't anywhere near that. If you're going to get things joined up in terms of where development is located, how infrastructure works, and I think, as Lilli was saying, trying to get people to travel less, 15-minute city, having things close by without having to travel a long way to get to school or hospital or shops. You've got to start with a plan. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I think there is a real opportunity here to build upon the government's ambition for a green recovery, delivering on net zero, and to level up, is to enable those local areas, political leadership and executive leadership to come together with a spatial strategy that then provides the bedrock, not only for delivering integration, but also bedrock for investment, which is really important for you guys, because you want certainty. You want certainty over planning if you're going to make investment, because you don't just drop in a planning application. As you know, it can take many years of pre-application master planning before you're ready to go for an investment. Now, clearly there's an ambition to shrink those years and make the whole thing much more streamlined. But one thing you want is certainty. And I would just end by saying, we have a discretionary planning system in the UK, unlike, for example, zonal planning, which many of you will be familiar with in Europe or America, and there is no one-size-fits-all zonal. And some people don't like it, but some people do like it, because the thing with the discretionary system is you've got flexibility to pivot. Everything isn't so bolted down that you have to go back and change the zone. There is discretion, and great things can happen. But I would urge any of you who are thinking about broadening your portfolio, making investment, to really don't underestimate the importance of going and speaking to the planners and the local leaders at the get-go, because I'm sure you've got a great story to tell in terms of investing in green and jobs. But it's about getting that broader community on board at the outset. So plan, but also communication, early dialogue.
I definitely concur with that. Alan, perhaps we could bring you in on this and how you see these strategies being implemented.
Thank you very much. I would emphasise that time is of the essence. It's a good point that that Victoria brought up about the UK system being discretionary. So there are examples of what I would call a sort of virtuous projects that actually are good for the city, good for the planet, good for investors, and good for occupants and users. So I think it's how these are presented. So for example, if you take one building that I've written about in my presidential column is the Zigzag building on Victoria Street in London, opposite Westminster Council offices. And that, the session, I caught the end of the session that we just had, the first session, and it was talking, I sensed it was, how do we change the system? How do we change attitudes toward, let's call it capitalism and investment? And in that particular project, instead of looking at a building that would be demolished after 50 years, It was presented as a construction that would last 150 years. So therefore, it could be taller. Because it was seen as setting a standard going forward. It operated at a very good level at a city level. Because of that, its green credentials, if you like, it attracted certain investors. And then there was a bidding war to actually be the tenant of that building. So you get this, is what I mean by this sort of virtuous circle of where it starts to, in some ways, it's both top down and bottom up. If we're looking at wanting to attract the best employees to work in a particular office building, they will choose certain projects because of employers because of what they offer in terms of the environment. So you get this sort of, as I say, top down in terms of city and bottom up in terms of users. So it's really looking at all of the stakeholders and how everybody wins.
Yeah, thank you. Simon, do you have any insights on this from like a sort of young urbanist perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I've always got a mandate to express the needs of young people, I think, in cities. Can I ask a quick question to the audience, though? Please raise your hand if you currently live or have in the past lived in London. And then those who no longer or weren't born in London, excuse me, if you were born in London, please keep your hand up. The rest of you put your hand down. So there's 2 people out of, I'd say, probably about 80% of the crowd who actually was born in London, because the reality is most people come to large cities in their 20s. That's the only positive net migration group. And cities, have been fueled by this kind of, in-migration of young people seeking essentially good job opportunities and excellent socializing opportunities. It's the kind of economic and social pillar. But my main kind of key trend, which I want to emphasize, is that that's only 2 parts of the bottom line. And today, people are looking for 3 things when they come to cities. It's a great kind of social life, amazing job opportunities, and also to have a positive or reduce their environmental impact. And indeed, people in cities do have, on average, a slightly lower environmental impact than people living in rural areas. But there needs to be a lot more done, I feel, in terms of the provision of workspaces, housing in particular, and the ways we travel between them, in terms of making them all more sustainable. And I think in kind of, I suppose in summary, I don't think it's any coincidence that BoKlok, am I saying that okay? Yeah, sure. But they, you have a development in Bristol right now, and Bristol has the strong leadership capabilities to say they have a zero carbon agenda, which actually enables the young people in the marketplace to respond to the new consumer needs of those who kind of fuel the city in their 20s. Not to say the city isn't for everyone, but that's just my small point.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. The next question I had is, what do you see the role of modern technologies in adapting our cities for climate change? I know, Lilli, you've obviously talked about as a net zero railway. What are the barriers to you achieving your goals, that goal at the moment?
Yeah, the interesting thing about a net zero railway is it's the same old infrastructure, but powered by renewable energy. So it isn't really in the realms of new technology. Okay, and that's what I think is quite interesting, is it's actually about bringing sort of modern new developments, like renewable energy developments, in as part of our normal way of running our business. There are lots of barriers, though, that make it difficult for large institutions to start functioning in this way, in terms of simple things about how do you take the risk of contracting for electricity for 10 or 15 years? When do you go into the market? Not right now, probably, because it's a tricky time. But I say that, but that's exactly when we are thinking of going to the market. So I'm literally sort of wrestling with these dilemmas. So there are a range of challenges, some of which are technical, and others are much more practical in terms of how do you have the technical expertise, the legal expertise, the financial backing to be able to make the right investments and choices. One thing I would say, and it's sort of slightly back to what you were saying at the beginning, which is there's so much merit in making better use of existing infrastructure in terms of what we've had. If we look at how London as a city has grown, just over the last 10 or 15 years, it's grown by about 1.5 million people. And actually its footprint hasn't really increased at all. And indeed we haven't, although it feels like we've been building lots of new infrastructure on the public transport network, in aggregate, most of it was already there. And actually what you're doing is increasing the efficiency by which we're using it. We are moving so many more people simply by incremental improvements, technology improvements. Digitizing the railway allows us to run, which just means that the signals are no longer manual, they're digital. You can increase the capacity really significantly. And I think that's why cities may be the place where young people want to live, but they're also really a sustainable place to live moving forward, because you can make so much better use of the resources and infrastructure that you've already put in place.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like we've got questions in the audience. Would you like to ask one?
Is this on? Hi. So my question, I think, is mainly aimed at Victoria, but kind of everybody. And yes, I completely agree with the need for kind of more retrofit. Obviously, as Alan said, the greenest building is a building that already exists. And short of us kind of regulating embodied carbon or having kind of reducing the tax on retrofit versus building new, those are issues in themselves. But where we are encouraging retrofit, there's another big problem, which is the extension of permitted development rights. And that kind of goes against these sustainable planning and kind of sustainable variety of use in town centres. And just to reflect on what do you think is happening there, where the government's kind of made proposals in their planning for the future white paper and the extension of permitted development.
Wow, I'm very impressed. I wasn't expecting such a technical question, but it's a good job I'm a chartered town planner, because I can answer this question, but I'll try and keep it high level for the rest of the audience. I mean, there's been so many U-turns recently, and indeed pausing the white paper just before it was paused, the response, or the planning bill as you'll know it, before the reshuffle at the weekend was very widely touted as another U-turn. Where we'd like to see a U-turn is on permitted development rights. We talk about this big bang planning reform. Meanwhile, there were some pretty big bangs last year that happened via statutory instruments. Some of them were great. They relaxed things on high streets, and I think we can all see the benefit of that. Lots of you live in London. Places have been activated and kept alive. You know, even where my office is in Monument, generally speaking, it's quite quiet, but it suddenly became a tourist destination because the city, which previously would never have allowed chairs and tables outside certain bars and restaurants, they're there. And it looks like that's set to continue, and we warmly welcome that. The real rub was this permitted development rights, that it was already a thing anyway, and it enabled landlords to convert offices to residential, and arguably all the ones that were going to be converted have already been converted, because that kind of ship sailed. But we had a new Class E launched last year for those planning anoraks in the room. If you're not already one, maybe you'll be by the end of this. But what Class E did, in this discretionary system, we've got so many different classes: cafes, doctors' surgeries, estate agents, solicitors, and it basically lumped a load of them into a Class E. Which meant a gym was the same classification as an estate agent or a post office or a solicitors. And sort of to add salt to the wound, if you like, that's one thing. Flexibility, great, but now permitted developments are enabled for Class E. So it's not just offices, it's all of the above. The high street, which was doing okay, and people really value their high streets because we've all been at home in our local areas accessing our high streets because we could walk there when we were in a lockdown. We reconnected with it. We just feel that this is unhelpful at a time when, if you're a landlord, some of you may be, you haven't had your rent. you've got an opportunity perhaps to turn that commercial property into residential. And in the UK, with the exception of a couple of industrial estates on the M1 and possibly bits of Park Royal, it's a one-way street. When something goes residential, unless you're a philanthropist, it won't come back to commercial again. And so we do feel that that is a bit of an Achilles heel. And if there was one U-turn left in government, which probably there isn't, but if there was one, for me, that's the one. Please, they need to take stock and find out what's going on. But we think you've got this perfect storm of the rental protections ending, so people are going to get kicked out. The PDRs come in for Class E, and we need more homes. So we're absolutely, we need more homes, but don't put them on the ground floor of the high street, please. Put them up the top. So anyway, there you go.
To add to that.
This might turn into a planning masterclass, by the way, so get your questions in now. You can tick off your CPD. You'll all be town planners by the end of it. You can join as affiliates, by the way, but sorry.
No, I was just to say, and to recognise that there is 359,000 empty homes in the UK currently as well. And we should kind of put our attention into retrofitting those to be performing well before I think we disrupt the town centres.
It's big business. Retrofit is huge business, and it's a point well made.
Thank you. Do we have another question? Lady over there. Back. Oh, one at the back. Sorry, there's one. Well.
Shall I go first?
Yes.
Okay, hi, I'm at the back.
Oh, right.
Yeah, okay, I've got just a point to make and a small question to ask. I'm Martin Seeger from Grantham Institute at Imperial College in London. I'm a glaciologist, and I'll come to that in a second. Firstly, Lydia, your comment about Bristol is very interesting, and I've often heard it said that Bristol is this amazing place where all the action is taking place, but the reality is it isn't. You just have to walk down White Ladies Road for 2 minutes and wonder what the fuss is about with Bristol, because it's really not doing a job. The mayor is in favour of airport expansion. So I really don't, Bristol speaks a good game, but like many places, the actions aren't following it up. I've got absolutely no confidence it will be net zero by 2030. It's only 8 years' time. Now, question to you all. I'm a glaciologist, and my research is in Antarctica and how Antarctica is changing, and I'm struck by how no one mentions sea level change. And the fact that the IPCC report can't rule out 1.5 metres of sea level rise this century and 5 metres by 2050. So Lilli, you're quite right, London's been around for 1,000 years. Does it have another 150 years left?
Who would like to go on this?
I'm happy to pick it up. I mean, I think, brilliant question. So we work very closely with the Environment Agency, who is looking at sea level rises. And I think there are some scenarios in which the real drastic change happens, and large parts of the city would be impacted. So you're right to raise this, but our role is to then look at what we could do to mitigate that, work with the agency to see what the future scenarios sort of really throw up in terms of to land use change. So I mean, I don't know quite what answer you're looking for, apart from yes, it's a very serious scenario that is part of what the planning is looking at, and not all of the worst case scenarios can be controlled, which is why it's a climate emergency.
Victoria?
I mean, just to add, I'm not an architect, but coincidentally, I've been hanging out with some at a housing conference this week, one of whom specialises in this specific area. I was chairing a panel with him this week. And some of you may have heard of the amphibious house from Great Designs, may have thought it was sort of something off in the future, but actually there's a lot of work going on at the moment to design homes that are already on the floodplain, lots of it. The Environment Agency have their zoning of, where you wouldn't build, and, guess what? There's a lot of stuff already on it. So I do think there's quite a big market retrofitting some of that to ensure that it's flood resilient, because, again, in another part of the UK today and yesterday, there's the flood conference. I think it's going on at the NEC right now. In fact, one of my heads of policy is up there talking on it, because it's not about how do we sort of pretend flood's not happening, and there's some very good examples where, you know, New Orleans has just been rebuilt, parts of it on the floodplain. You know, it's just, well, hang on, this is going to happen again in another 100 years. Why would you do that? It's about how you build it into resilience so that you can learn to live with it in certain areas. But interested to have a chat with you afterwards, and I could certainly put you in touch with one of the leading architects who's doing this work right now, advising BEIS on it, because it's about how we build in that flood resilience into homes and commercial buildings, recognising that many of them are already on the floodplains already.
Yep. Tiny point to add, and I think we naturally gravitate to talking about carbon systems when we're talking about climate change, when really there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on which we need to do in order to secure the safety of the future of the planet, from kind of biodiversity and ecology to phosphorus systems. So that's just a kind of small point, and we do things like ecological footprinting when we're designing buildings and evaluating them as part of a wider kind of land use strategy. But yeah, it would be love to talk as well about building resilient communities.
Alan, did you have anything to add?
Yes, in that the question about sea level, I remember actually over 40 years ago seeing an illustration in the Radio Times about what would happen, a map of the UK and Ireland, showing what would happen with sea levels and how London would disappear and so on. And to me, you know, that we can talk about technologies, which was a point of one of the earlier questions. My point to Chris Pincher, who's the housing minister at the minute, is really we can't rely on, let's say, building houses on polystyrene or something like that and making them float. Really what we need to do is design in terms of form and arrangement first, and then in terms of fabric, and then technology. So it's actually finding ways to address you know, first of all, we have to minimise the rise in sea level. So that's why all of this is so urgent. Yes, we can try and accommodate it, but really we've got to really move to stopping the climate increasing in terms of temperature, and then looking at as many passive technologies as possible, rather than active and think, you know, matters that would become obsolete over time. We have to really focus on the main issue, which is actually reducing carbon emissions.
Brilliant, thank you. Next question, this lady. I'm conscious we've run out of time.
Hi, my name is Beatrice Bondi. I'm from Investor AB. I have more of a practical comment to make, which, I mean, I lived 30 years of my life in London in different properties, and every time I wanted to change a window, was hardly possible, because most of the housing stocks is old, is Victorian, and you always have a department in the local authority who says you can't change the look. And often you have to change the look of a window if you want to have a proper insular window. And it would be such an easy thing to save energy for lots of people, because I mean, normal windows in London, I mean, let's not fool ourselves, the air comes in and out. You don't even need to open the window to have air. And I know that a lot of people coming from the continent, from what we now call Europe, since Great Britain is not part of Europe anymore, is actually aghast at the situation. And it is such an easy thing to do. But yes, I mean, I even had to rechange a window once because I hadn't asked, and no, there was no way you could change a window. And the last building where I lived, which was a mansion house, all the windows were changed. It took 5 years of discussion with the Westminster local authorities. So, I mean, we can talk about planning and whatever you want, but when reality hits you, you know, it's a very different thing. So what do you have to say about that?
Very good point.
Victoria?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a Swedish friend, so I know all about drafts, and she tells me how terrible the houses are over here, and whenever her mother visits, it's just appalling, and how could we possibly put up with it? I think, you know, obviously, if you're living in a conservation area or a listed building, there have tended to be some very good reasons why there are these checks and balances in place over the type of windows that's been replaced, and that's because whilst you may be a good guardian of said property and want it to look very much as it was intended. There have been some very terrible examples where bits of our heritage and look and feel have gone and they're not coming back. I know it's incredibly difficult because the RTPI, we own our own building, and it's a townhouse in the city. It's drafty, and we've got to replace all the windows. What I do know is things are improving in terms of the supply chain and the companies that can now provide those wooden windows that we have to replace like for like, so that it maintains that Georgian feel. So I think things have improved. They have moved on. The products are there. We need more of them, more accessible, obviously more affordable. So it has improved from the situation that you described, but it is, you know, certainly in the past, it has been hard going. So I do recognise what you're saying, but I would say that the reasons that those checks and balances are in place is to preserve that architectural quality of conservation areas or areas protected. And that is, of course, one of our great assets, if you like. We're sitting in one now, and those windows would be quite difficult to replace. But you would want them to look like they do now if you were doing so. So I do appreciate the frustrations. I would say I think it's improving because the supply chain has improved, the market's there. But,
good answer.
Well, yeah, having also volunteered in a North London conservation area community group, I have so much sympathy for you, because even in the local community, there's a big conflict between conservatorship and stewardship and introducing green policies. But just to go back to the point I made earlier about sort of galvanizing green leadership, I think there's really two things that can be done. And I'll use the kind of Green Homes Grant, which was a national policy of the past couple of years, advocated by the government to improve people's insulation and environmental performance of their homes. But there was such a low uptake because it was dispensed essentially very centrally. But if you can empower city leaders, I believe, to remove the red tape around applying for things like green subsidies for your homes or for offices, and B, removing the red tape around planning to kind of create a more streamlined process for some of those new developments or renovations, then I think that's a big step forwards.
I'm conscious that everyone's probably quite desperate for coffee, but we have one last question, and then we'll bring it to a close.
Touch the microphone again. I promise. It's relevant. Just to kind of say, there's a lot of things happening in the kind of volunteer movement in the construction and built environment industry. The Lilli, London Emissions Transformation Initiative, are working up a retrofit guide. The Architects Climate Action Network are doing a lot of work around this. There's a conservation planning reform group happening, which is working together with Lilli and Heritage Declares exactly on these issues. And I really encourage that everyone looks up these things. There's going to be guidance coming out, and there's a campaign called Households Declare, which is exactly on that. It's about declaration points about, in the lead up to COP, kind of on the back of the failed Green Homes Grant, how we could improve the performance of everybody's homes, and kind of resources for people, householders, homeowners, to help.
That sounds brilliant.
Right. Thank you, Lydia, and thank you, the panel. And thank you, Alan, for joining us from Belfast as well. Nice to see you.